Joining me now is Delaware Democratic Senator Chris Coons. He is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and one of President Biden's top allies on Capitol Hill. Senator Coons, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Great to be on with you again.
I want to start off, if I can, with that breaking news out of Moscow, what state media is referring to as a terror attack. Is there anything that you can tell us about this situation? Any details that you can provide from briefings that you're getting there on Capitol Hill?
I have no additional information that I can share with you about possible actors who may have carried out this attack. It is a tragic loss of life at a civilian concert, but there are obvious different organizations and individuals who might be motivated to carry out an attack within Russia. The recent election, there was widespread demonstrations of opposition to Putin, particularly following the murder of Navalny in a Siberian prison camp, and of course the ongoing Russian aggression, the brutality of their aggression in Ukraine and the previous war in Chechnya. So I can't share with you any specifics about who might be responsible, but there are both internal and external foes of Putin and his brutal regime who could easily have been motivated to carry out this attack.
Well, again, we will continue to track it and bring you and our viewers any updates as we get it, even throughout this conversation. But, Senator, let me shift to the events unfolding in the Middle East. As you know, the United States has proposed to the UN Security Council a resolution calling for a sustained ceasefire in Gaza. This was obviously rejected by China, by Russia. It comes as Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the region, pressing Prime Minister Netanyahu not to go in to Rafah. What is your assessment of how the Biden administration is handling this right now? Prime Minister Netanyahu seems defiant. He's still going into Rafah.
Well, I think we should be specific about what we're talking about. It is clear from both what President Biden has said, Secretary Blinken has said, my conversations with the Israeli ambassador and with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the United States still respects and supports the obligation of Israel to protect its citizens from Hamas. So small-scale, targeted special operations forces against Hamas leadership, or efforts to try and secure the release of those hostages still being held by Hamas in and underneath Gaza in tunnels. I believe it's their 167th day. And I recently met with John and Rachel, who are the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland. The pain of those families is just palpable. I believe President Biden continues to recognize that there's an obligation on the part of the Israeli government to defend their people. What he is calling on Prime Minister Netanyahu to do is to first develop and implement a plan to relocate innocent Palestinian civilians, nearly 1 million of them who have fled to Rafah from other parts of Gaza at the direction of the IDF in the early stages of this war, before any large-scale operations, before bombing or sending in large infantry units that could cause thousands of civilian casualties. And that is the point of friction with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it's my earnest hope that they will not move ahead with a large-scale assault on Rafah. There is a team that has come over to the United States to consult with our military experts on how best to conduct an operation. And my hope is there won't be a break in our relationship over this.
Let me ask you about Prime Minister Netanyahu. Last year, you called him exceptionally difficult, an exceptionally difficult partner. I wonder then, do you agree with what we heard from Chuck Schumer, that there should be elections in Israel in the near future so that there can be a new prime minister who would support a two-state solution, for example?
Well, to be clear, the governing coalition that Prime Minister Netanyahu relies on includes extremists like Minister Smotrich and Minister Ben-Gvir, who represent political parties within Israel who are opposed to a two-state solution, who have called for the removal of Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza, and who advocate for positions on settlements and on the treatment of Palestinians that are, I think, well outside the mainstream of decades of U.S.-Israeli dialogue. I think Senator Schumer gave a forceful and clear speech, both about his deep affection for and commitment to Israel and its future as a Jewish democracy. and his concerns that this ally, this close and trusted partner of ours, has in the conduct of the war in Gaza under Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership gotten into a place that has really harmed Israel's reputation globally and here in the United States. And so Senator Schumer's remarks, I hope anyone who's criticizing or questioning them will listen to them in their entirety. He was clear and balanced in his denunciation, his criticism of Hamas and their terrorism, their brutality, in his call for Hamas to release hostages, and his recognition that we could have a complete and immediate ceasefire if Hamas would simply stop their aggression against Israel.
Given what you are saying you would like to see in terms of any type of invasion into Rafah, would you condition aid? Would you support aid being conditioned to Israel if Israel does not meet what the United States is asking for?
If Israel were to use the weapons and the financial support that we provide to just go into Rafah at a very large scale, use 1,000-pound bombs and use infantry and military tactics that kill thousands and thousands of Palestinian civilians without taking into account an alternative path that might secure safety for a majority of those civilians, I would take that step. Yes, that's something I've never said before, and it's meant to convey the intensity and the sincerity of my concern about the consequences here. This is an unprecedented challenge for Israel. Egypt is not allowing any Palestinians to leave Gaza and go into the Sinai. There is no other place for them to safely go, and there has to be provision made. As I mentioned earlier, 1 million Palestinians from throughout Gaza have moved to Rafah because that's a place the IDF earlier in this conflict identified as a safe zone. So I think the IDF, which has complete control over the perimeter of Gaza, and there is no risk that Hamas will rearm and re-equip in the coming weeks. They have the time, and I think they have the obligation to come up with a plan that will provide for safety for civilians and allow them to carry out precise, targeted, small-scale operations to continue to go after Hamas leadership.
Well, it certainly is significant that you are saying that you would support aid being conditioned. Let me ask you, Speaker Johnson is floating the idea of potentially inviting Prime Minister Netanyahu to address Congress. Is that something that you would support? Is that an appropriate next step for him to take?
Look, I've had a chance to meet with the Prime Minister several times in Israel in the last few months. This would be unprecedented. He would be the only foreign leader in our history to address our Congress 3 times. Look, I would hope that any future engagement between the Prime Minister and the United States and our Congress and our President will move towards a consensus view about support for a 2-state solution. I'm not sure that an address to Congress will reduce the temperature of our engagement. I think the path forward here is clear and simple, and one in which sustained bipartisan support for Israel is not only desirable but possible. But first, there has to be a more concerted and successful effort to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza and to target the use of force, specifically at Hamas leadership and at securing the release of hostages.
Well, I do want to ask you about the politics of this. We have seen a drag on President Biden's poll numbers. I want to show 2 new CNN polls. Senator, these are out today. They show a tied race in battleground Pennsylvania, and they show President Biden trailing former President Trump in Michigan. Do you think that the situation in Gaza is the reason that those 2 battleground states show such divergent numbers and the toll that it's taking on President Biden?
Look, I don't know the internals of the poll in Michigan. I will say this. I recently was in Michigan for a weekend campaigning for President Biden and got a very positive reception because of the very significant positive impact that President Biden's actions on bringing manufacturing back to the United States, investing in semiconductor manufacturing, his support for unions, and the wage increases that the UAW and others have had in Michigan. So that you have to take that into account and balance it against widespread concerns about the war in Gaza. President Biden, from the very beginning, from October, just after the October 7th Hamas attacks, has made it clear that he strongly supports Israel and their right of self-defense And from the beginning, he has conveyed he expects Israel to balance that with respecting their international obligations under the rules of war to protect civilians and deliver humanitarian relief. As the war has gone on, those have gotten in sharper and sharper tension. And as a result, I think it's made the relationship between our president and Israel's prime minister more difficult. But there is a positive path forward here, and one that I hope they will take. In the last conversation I had with the Israeli ambassador, they thought they were really on the verge of a hostage deal where Hamas would release a significant number of hostages, and there would be weeks of a cessation of violence and the ability to get humanitarian aid in its scale. I respect that President Biden is trying every possible way, through airdrops, through delivery by sea, through partnerships with different other countries and NGOs to deliver aid into Gaza to prevent starvation. Our Israeli partners who share so much with us in values should be doing the same. And it's my hope that we'll see that in the days ahead.
Senator, before I let you go, I do want to get your reaction to Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene bringing a motion to vacate against Speaker Johnson. She says this is not a pink slip, it's just a warning sign. But what do you make of this? And can you give us an update? Is the government going to stay open? Will you all get this done by midnight tonight?
Well, look, we were supposed to have this done 6 months ago. We are 6 months into the federal fiscal year. And here in the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, we passed all of our appropriations bills out of committee last summer. The House has really struggled. The chaos, the dysfunction over there, which was brought on by a small group of Freedom Caucus activists who brought down Speaker McCarthy for trying to move forward on a debt ceiling deal, on appropriations bills. The House Republican majority is showing that they have an extreme faction that is just not committed to governing, to running our government and our country in a responsible way. I can't tell you right now whether we'll have a shutdown. And I want you and our viewers to think for a moment about what message it sends to the world if the government of the United States, and this package includes our Department of Defense and our Department of Homeland Security, if the world watches on the news that once again we have failed to come to an agreement and we have to shut down big portions of our government. Security operations like federal prisons and Border Patrol and our military will still function. I don't want anyone to be alarmed, but the non-essential functions will shut down. This is in the hands of a few extreme Republicans here in the Senate, whether or not they will demand that we stay in session through the weekend and force us to shut down and then be here through next week to try and bring it back.
But right now you're a yes. I'm getting a hard rap from my producer.
Absolutely, I'm a yes.
Okay, all right. Senator, thank you for answering all my questions. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.